So JPA transaction. So these are the topics that we are going to cover. First, let's talk about transaction types that are supported over JPA. There are two different transaction types that are supported in JPA. One is resource local transactions, and the other one is Java Transaction API, JTA in short. So far what we have seen was the first one, resource local transactions, typically running over Java SE application. And JTAs are used for performing a transaction with multiple participating resources. So these are called distributed transactions. So as a default, well, you specify this transaction type in persistence unit. In other words, persistence.xml file. You specify what transaction type you want to use. For Java SE environment, the default is resource local, and for Java EE environment, the default is JTA. Again, so far what we have seen is Java SE based application. That's the reason the persistent XML file was using resource local. So let's see examples of this. By the way, you might actually see my screen and my voice a little bit not syncing because I'm still in Mexico and the internet connection is not as good as it could be. So I'm trying to slow down a bit whenever I change slides. I'll try to give a second or so that you can catch up, just in case you have that issue. Okay, well actually that's my issue, so it's not your problem. Okay, so resource local. So in resource local, you are going to use entity manager factory to create entity manager object. And this entity manager object represents persistent context, and this is something that we talked about quite extensively before. And entity manager factory will be injected with persistent unit annotation, while actually persistent context is for Java SE and JTA environment. Okay, so in Java SE environment, you cannot when you're using resource local, you cannot use persistent context. This is for Java EE and JTA environment, and you have to use entity transaction object to begin and commit around your entity manager transactions. By the way, if you call create entity manager twice, that means it's going to create two entity manager instances which represent two separate persistent context objects. By the way, persistent context object is basically a set of entities. You can think of it, let's say, this collection of entities. Okay, so this is a persistence.xml file for resource local. So you can see persistence unit name and transaction type is set as resource local. Okay, so this is the way that you are going to create entity manager object. Again, we have seen this one many times. So from you create the entity manager factory object by providing the name of your persistence unit, and from the entity manager factory object you are going to create entity manager. So here you have to create entity manager yourself, okay? And then you are going to have entity transaction object from entity manager, and then you are going to begin and commit or rollback after some persistency operation. Okay, so nothing new. Now JTA, so in this case, the entity manager will be injected by the container. So you do not create entity manager yourself, meaning it will be injected. So the way that you specify your desire to have entity manager so that it can be injected by the container is by using this annotation called the persistence context. Okay, and then entity manager will be injected by the container. as we are going to talk about in a bit more detail later on, entity manager given by the container is a reference to persistent context associated with J2A transaction. So I'm going to explain this one in a bit more detail later on. So if you do not understand what I'm talking about with this statement, that's perfectly fine. So this is persistence unit, persistence XML file. So here you specify transaction type with JTA, and then you specify data source object. So this data source object is assumed to have been configured. Okay, so in JTA, your entity manager object will be injected by the container if you specify with @persistence context annotation. Okay. Let's move on to transactional attributes. So transaction attribute control the scope of a transaction. So if method A on the left is calling method B of another being, the transaction object that got started by the method A might be propagated, or it might be suspended, depending on what transaction attribute that you are going to use. So we'll see each of these in a bit more detail. Okay, so transaction attribute annotation. So we are going to look into these two, okay, required and required new, because those are two most frequently used transaction attribute. So when transaction attribute of required is set on a method, what that means is that if the client running with the transaction and invoke this method, then the method will be executed by caller's transaction. So I use the term client. So if the client already has a transaction, then the method, meaning in this case callee method, will use the same transaction object. However, if the caller or client does not have a transaction object, then the method will trigger creation of new transaction object. So in this case, container will start the new transaction before running the method. So it's recommended for most cases. And by the way, if you don't specify transaction attribute on your method, then this is the default. Requires new, however, is that regardless whether the client or caller is providing a transaction, the new transaction will be created. Okay, so suppose the client already has a transaction object. In this case, the container will suspend the client transaction, and then it will start a new transaction, and then it delegates the call to the method and resumes. So once the method is done, then it will resume the caller's transaction. Okay, so in this case, the method that is being called will use new transaction. Okay. However, if the client is not associated with any client does not provide a transaction, then container will start the new transaction anyway. So it always starts the new transaction regardless whether caller has transaction or not. So this is how you are going to specify transaction attributes. So here we say this is the stately session being, and this transaction required could be set on the class level. That means this transaction attribute will be used for all method. Okay. So here we have persistent context annotation, and then we have entity manager, and then we can do persistence operation. In this case, we are doing query operation, and we create the query, and then invoke the query, and here we are performing persist operation. Alright, so let's do our first demo, transaction attributes. So in this case, we have two tables. One is savings table and the other one is checking account table. So if you take a look at this database tables in the samples, we have checking account. So if you see the data, we have two people. We have two people, John and Mary, and John has $970 in his checking account, and we're not going to use the Mary, so we're going to mostly focus on John. And then savings account. Let's see, savings account. John has savings account of $1,030. Okay. So John has two accounts, savings account and checking account. So you can see checking account of John has $970, and savings account John has $1,030. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to transfer $10 from checking account to savings account, and we certainly want to do it in transactional manner because what you're going to do is you are going to withdraw $10 from checking account and then you are going to deposit to savings account. So these two operations, withdrawal and saving, should happen in a transaction. So that is the code. Let's see. Okay, so this is EJB, and let's run the application first of all. So for now, these two operations are performed in transactional manner. So what we should see is that $10 is withdrawn from checking account and $10 will be deposited to savings account. Okay, so that is the expected operation. And what we're going to try is that we are going to roll back. We're going to run the application with the rollback in the middle of these two operations and see whether that works. Okay. Yeah, looks like a glass fish has to be up and running. So, okay, yeah, it's doing it. Good. So what we are going to see is basically this statement that John has now $960, and then the savings account is $1040. So if you actually verify in the database, that should be the case. So let's see, view data. And you can see $10 is subtracted from checking account and savings account. It should have $1,040 as expected. Alright, so let's take a look at the code. So we have checking. So we have a checking bean and then we have savings bean. So the deposit, so each of these beans has a deposit and withdraw method, and each of these is set with the transaction attribute of required. So they always actually get started with the transaction. And now let's take a look at the web application. So in this web application, what we do is, so in this servlet, we inject these two beans, EJB beans. So we have savings bean and checking bean, and then we have user transaction injected with the resource annotation. So basically what it does is that the transaction begins and then it will perform. So let's actually expand the screen. So it performs a withdrawal of $10. So we are actually subtracting $10, and then we are depositing to savings account, and that is done within the transaction. Okay, so that should work as expected. Now for the test, instead of commit, we are going to now roll back. Okay, and let's run this application. So this time, this is actually before the rollback. So even though this says 950 and 1050, if you actually take a look at the database, nothing changed. Okay, so if you actually see view data, so that the thing that you have seen is actually from the before the rollback. So you can see, it didn't change. So it's still $960, and savings account is if you see the value, it is still 1040. So both accounts didn't change because we rolled back. Now let's try to roll back in the middle. So here the code is this code. We are going to roll back this guy in the middle after, let's say, withdrawal. Okay, and again, this should not change the database table at all because we rolled back in the middle, right? Okay, so just this sample code is basically verifying the transaction is behaving as expected. Okay. Okay, so it still thinks again, this is before rollback. So again, if you go back and see the database, nothing should have changed. Checking account, view data. Okay, 960. Things didn't change. So let's just change it back. So we're not gonna do this. Okay, so if you try again right now, then it should perform the $10 withdrawal and the $10 deposit. Okay, so now this is now if you actually see the actual database, it should have $950 like this. Okay, all right, so let's move on. Nothing that much exciting. So let's talk about the entity manager and transaction type. So this is actually an important topic on this presentation. So container managed entity manager uses the JTA transaction, and that is in fact the persistent context propagation or sharing of persistent context with the JTA transaction is supported by the container. So again, we'll talk about this one in a bit more detail in the next slide. Okay. So in terms of the relationship between transaction and persistent context, so remember, persistent context is a set of entities. Okay, so you can think of persistent context as like a container of entities. Now, this is important. The life cycle in JTA, by the way, in JTA, the life cycle of persistent context is aligned with the life cycle of a transaction. What it means is, when a new transaction starts, new persistent context gets created. Okay? And when transaction is done, either through commit or rollback, the persistent context is also gone. Okay? So the persistent context gets created when a new transaction is created, and it will be gone when transaction is finished. Now, a same transaction context could be shared between calling and called methods when the same transaction is used. So what would be the case where same transaction is used? So example is like this. If the calling method and called method are annotated, both of them are annotated with the required. In that case, the called method will use the same transaction created by the calling method, right? This is something that we talked about when we talked about required transaction attribute, because callee method will use the same transaction of the caller when callee method is annotated with required. Okay? In that case, because the same transaction is used between the caller method and callee method, same persistent context is also shared. Okay, which means that both calling and callee method will see the same set of entities. Okay, I hope that actually is something that they will actually see. We'll do the demo on this, so hopefully you will have a better understanding if you don't understand what I just said here. Okay. Alright, so this is the demo. Let me explain this demo scenario. Okay, and you will understand what I mean by persistent context and transactions. The life cycle of both are in fact aligned, okay, in JTA environment. So we have two stateless beans called the employee service bean and audit service bean. So employee service bean contains method. It contains create employee method and create employee to method. They are calling bean because this create employee method will call a method of audit service bean, and this is called the callee bean because this audit service bean contains the methods log transaction and log transaction to method that are being invoked by the create employee method and create employee to method. So let me actually use this statement. The create employee method of employee service bean invokes the log transaction method of audit service bean. Okay. Now, as you will see the code in the following slide, the create employee method is set with required as a default, and when it calls log transaction method is set with required. So in this case, both of them are set with required attribute. What that means is this log transaction method, which is a callee method, will use the same transaction provided by this caller method. At the same time, this is important, this guy will share the same persistent context object that this guy is using. Okay, meaning in this case, both of these methods will see the same set of entities. Now, the second scenario is this. Now we have create employee to method is calling log transaction to method. Now, create employee to method as a default will be set with required. However, log transaction to method is set with required new, meaning log transaction to method will create its own transaction object. What that means is it will create its own version of persistence context object. So in this case, create employee to method and log transaction to method do not share the same persistent context object. Okay, meaning they do not share the same set of entities. So that is important aspect. So this is the code in employee service bean. So again, this is a calling bean because it has a two method, create employee and create employee to, and is invoking another method of this audit service EJB. So because create employee method is not annotated with any transaction attribute, the default is set with required, transaction required. The same thing for this guy. Now let's take a look at these two methods, log transaction and log transaction to. As I said before, this first method, log transaction method, is annotated with required, meaning this method will share the same transaction of the calling method, in this case this guy, while log transaction to method is set with required new, which means new transaction object will be created by the container before this log transaction to method is invoked. What that means is new persistence context object is also created before this method is invoked. Now, if you see what we are doing here is that in this method, we are trying to find the employee object with employee ID. Okay? Now, when you call this find method, it's trying to find it in a persistent context. Meaning, remember, persistent context is a set of entities, right? So this is going to try to find that object with this employee ID in the persistent context object. In this case, it will find it because this guy, this method, and the calling method. So this is where employee object has been persisted, meaning now this employee object will be in the persistent context that this method is aware of. Okay, now when it's calling this method, because they share the same transaction, they share the same persistent context object, so this guy, this find method should succeed. However, on this guy, this create a new transaction, which means it also create a new persistent context object. So this same code is here. However, when it tried to find that object, it will not find it because they are using two different persistent context object. Okay, so that's what we are going to verify with the demo. So let me just repeat. We can just repeat what I said by reading this one more time. So scenario 1 is basically when create employee is calling log transaction method of the second bean. Okay, so that is the scenario 1. So create employee method of employee service bean invokes a log transaction method of audit service bean. Because because the log transaction method of the callee bean is set with required annotation. Okay, this is basically what I was about to say. So create employee method of bean1 start the new transaction A as a default because it is set as required, and thus creating a persistent context A. Now the newly created employee object A now belongs to persistent context A. So what I mean is here, when we persist this employee object, it belongs to persistent context A. That's what I mean here. Now transaction A and persistent context A of the create employee method of the calling bean is now shared, or sometimes we call propagated, to log transaction method of the callee bean. Okay, again because they use the same transaction and same persistent context. Okay, what that means is that log transaction method, the find method of log transaction method, has an access to employee object A that was saved by the create employee method, meaning persisted by create employee method. Okay, behind the scene scenario 2. So this is the case that create employee 2 method of the calling bean is calling log transaction 2 method of the audit service bean, the callee bean. So this callee method, log transaction 2, is set with required new annotation, meaning it will create new transaction and it will create a new persistent context object. Okay, so this is create. So let's start from create employee 2. It will create persistent context object A, and it does have its transaction A, right? Now log transaction 2 will create new transaction B and new persistent context B. Okay, so the calling method, this is a calling method, and this callee method, okay, they share nothing, meaning they do not share the same transaction object, they do not share the same persistent context object. So when find method in this callee method is trying to call, it will fail because it does not find that object, employee object, in its own persistent context. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies the concept. Okay, so let's run this application. So I explained the code by using the slide. So let's just run the application. Okay, so the one is this persistent context. Okay. So here I'm going to create a new employee. So let's say I'm going to give employee name number like a 44, and name is Shin, and the salary is $25 or something like that. So this is the first case where the calling method and callee method share the same transaction and thus same persistent context. So when I click this guy, it should find this employee object. Okay. Now, if I try to do the same thing with the create 2, this is the this scenario number 2, where the callee method is creating its own transaction and its own persistent context. So let's say maybe 66, name is XYXTA or something like that, salary is $67. Now let's try this. Now you will see unknown employee ID, okay, because in this case the callee method. So if you take a look at the callee method, so callee method is this audit service Java. So this one is using required new. So when you try to find employee object with the employee ID that is given, it will fail and it will throw the message unknown employee ID, and that's what we have seen. Okay. Alright, so that is the end of the presentation. So let me just